Right. Okay. So we are now on record mode. So in the last discussion, we had started off with the state of nature as determined by Hobbes. And we had suggested that the state of nature is marked by a few features. We had suggested that state of nature is first a state of equality, that everybody is equal in terms of body and mind. It suggested that there are limited resources and that therefore there is a state of conflict within the state of nature, that everybody is in a state of conflict. The reasons of the conflict are, competition, diffidence, and glory, and that therefore the state of nature is a state of continuous war, a war of everyone against everyone, and there is therefore no peace. And therefore Hobbes suggests that this state of nature creates severe unrest, that it does not provoke any activity, and therefore the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, having said that, what does Hobbes have to offer as a way of escaping this state of nature? Because in this state of nature, there is no concept of morality. The only morality that one has, or the only concern that one has, is to further his own cause. And therefore, there is no concept of justice, there's no concept of right and wrong, and therefore, one needs a situation from which, a way through which one can escape this situation of chaos and anarchy. Now, for this, what Hobbes suggests is to go back to a concept of a lex naturae, or a law of nature. Now, this law of nature, Hobbes defines as anything that a man will do to preserve his life and take out the means of preserving the same. Right? Therefore, the first law of nature is self-preservation. Right? So Hobbes is falling back upon this law of self-preservation to articulate a way of moving out of this state of nature. And therefore, this is the primary law. The primary law of nature is that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. So we do not go to war first, because we know that war can destroy us. We will first seek peace. And how does one seek peace? How does one ensure that one is at peace? Right. So first law of nature, seek peace at all costs. Second, if you do not find it, you have to prepare for battle. And therefore, Hobbes comes to his basic concept that we can seek peace by the law of social contract. Right? So what is this social contract? And you can see that I am quoting Hobbes, and because I want you to read the text in original, so that as far as possible, so that you see what Hobbes is trying to do. Now, the first final cause or design of men, he says, who naturally love liberty and dominion over others, is the introduction of that restraint upon yourselves. So under the social contract, you restrain yourselves and live in commonwealths. Is the foresight of their own preservation, of getting themselves out from that miserable condition of war, and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants. Right? Therefore, the social contract is a way in which we sacrifice our full-fledged rights in order to create a condition whereby somebody can maintain peace. So a social contract is therefore a way of restraining ourselves. We cannot do as we want to. Unrestrained liberty is not there in the social contract. Right. So how do we escape from the state of nature? Fear of death in case of war, and the desire for comfort. Because if you live in peace, you can cultivate, you can get industry, you can prosper, and therefore you can live in a state of comfort. It is by building on these passions that we can hope to construct a civil society, and therefore we need one person or one power to keep this entire fabric moving. Therefore, what Hobbes is suggesting is that this power will give us protection if we give it obedience. Now, the operative words here, therefore, are obedience to the sovereign. The sovereign might be of different kinds. He might be one person. He might be a body of persons. He might be equally a vast body of persons. But there must be one power to whom we submit, we surrender part of our rights, we obey, and therefore that power will give us protection. But this sovereign must be self-perpetuating, undivided, and ultimately absolute. Note these words: self-perpetuating, undivided. That means to say the sovereign must have no division within itself, and it must be ultimately absolute, that the sovereign will have entire powers in their entirety. They must not be fragmented. The sovereign is created by...
He should be omnipotent in a way.
He should be omnipotent in a way, absolutely. But you see, the point is that he should not be dictated by divine right. He should be given the power by the people rather than getting it only through inheritance, right? So the sovereign is created by, so the power is given to him by us. We create the sovereign, but is not a party to the compact. But once we have given power to the sovereign, so we are creating him, but once given the power, he is no longer going to be challenged by us. His power will be absolute. As you pointed out, he will be omnipotent, all powerful. He therefore cannot be got rid of. Look at this very carefully. He cannot be got rid of. You cannot depose the sovereign because he's in breach of the compact. So once you have agreed, you must obey. If he could be, his power would not after all be sovereign. But tumi jodi chao, if you want, you can depose him. But if you depose him, then his power is no longer sovereign and absolute. Therefore, he cannot be deposed. And therefore, Hobbes asks, what are the forms of government, therefore, that can be utilized here? What is the sovereign going to be like? What is the nature of the sovereign? The sovereign might be of many ways, It can be a democracy where everybody comes together to form an entire government of a lot of people. It can be, a meritocracy in which certain people are given the rights to rule. But Hobbes says there's a third way. And the third way is, he says, where all power lies with one person. And that is the monarch, right? And to compare, if you look at that section I have put in bold for you, to compare monarchy with the other two, we may observe that whosoever beareth the person of the people has also his natural person, and though he be careful in his politic person to procure the common interest, he is more or no less careful to procure the private good of himself, his family, kindred, and friends. What is Hobbes saying? Hobbes is saying that there are two kinds of interests: public interest and private interest. Now, if you have a group of people who are ruling, their private interests might collide, might be in conflict with that of the public interest. But because the sovereign is drawing power from the people and in his subjects his position is maintained, this one person who is the sovereign, who is the monarch, in him the private and the public good are together joined. Now this is a point, if you are reading Hobbes critically, this is a point where you can argue. You can argue, for example, with Henry VIII, who saw his own interest in taking Protestantism as a way of a personal divorce rather than the good of the people. But that is by the by. Hobbes is proposing that the sovereign, if he's a monarch, his own private good and the public good of the people are superimposed. The riches, power, and honor of a monarch, he writes, arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects, for no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor or contemptible, or too weak through want or dissension to maintain a war against their enemies. Now here, I would like you to see Leviathan as a double critique. Obviously, which side is Hobbes on? The king's side. He's on the royalist side when he's writing this tract, right? And he's arguing that, the king should be the sovereign and that the power of the sovereign is absolute. And once you have undertaken a social contract, you cannot breach it. But there's one critique here. He's suggesting that it is also in the interest of the sovereign to put the good of the public along with his personal good. So there is an oblique critique against the king also, that what we have seen through Charles I's action, that Charles was progressively alienating himself from the welfare of his subjects. And therefore, he was not putting the public interest in alignment with the private interest. His own private interest was getting foregrounded rather than the interest of the Commonwealth. Therefore, there are passages in this text, Leviathan, where you can see that Hobbes is also obliquely critiquing the king's intransience in maintaining peace and harmony within the Commonwealth. Hobbes says the ideal sovereign will be one who will amalgamate public and private good. Right. So then comes this concept of the definition of the social contract. I think this is the slide which you should go back to repeatedly. What is the social contract? I authorize, and everybody agrees, and give up my right of governing myself to this man. So I am no longer my own sovereign. I have surrendered my sovereignty to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like matter. This is the social contract. It's a term of law, and therefore you are transferring your own right, your own sovereignty, your own agency to this particular individual or body of individuals. Remember, therefore, you are creating a sovereign which is therefore composed of the body of the people, of the rights of the people, and therefore is an individual body. এটা একটু ভালো করে বোঝো কিন্তু, that this body is not merely a physical body. This is also a metaphorical body in that sense of the term. Now let me come across quickly to this picture, which is the title page of Leviathan, and you can see that body there. Let me move this cursor here, and you can see that this body of the sovereign is composed of numerous bodies, right? Numerous bodies, and it is from this that he's holding the crosier and the sword, and therefore is powerful in all aspects. So you can understand, therefore, that this is therefore the sovereign this is what we will call in modern parlance the state. And the state, according to Hobbes, is all powerful. Right. So, what are the rights of the sovereign? These are his rights. Right. Because a successive covenant cannot override a prior one, the subjects cannot change the form of covenant. You see, why Hobbes is writing this? He is bang in the middle of the Civil War. And therefore, this entire question is whether a person can be deposed, a monarch can be deposed. And Hobbes is suggesting no. Once there is a covenant, that person cannot be deposed. He is going to rule until and unless he has failed to provide peace and security to the people. Because the covenant forming the Commonwealth results from subjects giving to the sovereign the right to act for them, the sovereign cannot possibly breach the contract. So the sovereign also has a responsibility of maintaining this condition of peace. Now, herein lies this problem. You see, this I'll come to in slightly later on, what the problem is and why Hobbes was also, taken up by the Cromwellian party. I will come to this point because there's a contradiction here. Thirdly, the sovereign exists because the majority has consented to his rule. So 20 people have chosen Mr. X as the sovereign, 3 people haven't. What happens then to these 3 people? The minority have agreed to abide by this arrangement, right? So that is the principle of the, almost the majoritarian rule, that if the majority agree, then the minority cannot disagree with this opinion. Every subject is author of the acts of the sovereign. Hence, the sovereign cannot injure any of his subjects and cannot be accused of injustice. So you see, this question of the author. Who is authorizing the action of the sovereign? You are. Therefore, whatever the sovereign does, you are also party to that action. Therefore, there is no concept of injustice because you have given the sovereign the right to act for you. Therefore, you cannot protest his action. Following this, the sovereign cannot justly be put to death by the subjects. Please think of this text in the context of the Civil War, because when Hobbes is writing this, Charles I is already under tremendous stress. And as you know, in 1649, he will be beheaded. Therefore, when Hobbes is writing this, Hobbes is writing this in the decade between 1643 to 1649. It is only going to be published in 1651. So Hobbes is saying that the sovereign cannot be put to death. Because the purpose of the Commonwealth is peace, and the sovereign has the right to do whatever he thinks necessary for preserving of peace and security. Therefore, the sovereign may judge what opinions and doctrines are averse, who shall be allowed to speak to multitudes, and who shall examine the doctrines of all books before they are published. Why is this important? Because you see, this is talking about censorship. That the sovereign, if he feels that these doctrines are inimical to public good, he can censor these books. He can stifle these books and make his own propaganda. You see, very importantly, there's this question as to, is Hobbes a fascist? Because almost all these doctrines are suggesting absolute power of the state and the absolute power to stifle dissent as well, right? So there's this entire question and critique of Hobbes, that Hobbes is advocating a policy of almost fascism, right? The 7th law, to prescribe the rules of civil law and property. So the sovereign and the state, therefore, will decide what the rules of civil law and property are. To be judge in all cases. Obviously, the sovereign cannot be all the judges, but he will nominate the judges. to make war and peace as he sees fit, and to command the army. So the sovereign is all powerful over the military aspect of the state, to choose counselors, ministers, magistrates, and officers, to reward with riches and honor, or to punish with corporal or pecuniary punishment. Pecuniary is monetary, so fine or ignominy, and to establish laws about honor and a scale of worth. So what happens is that all rights of stifling dissent, of perpetual power, of laws, military, foreign policy, everything lies with the sovereign and therefore with the state. What Hobbes is looking at, therefore, is a very, very strong statist-centric power, that all power is hereby transferred from the individual to the state, and within the body of the sovereign, all power is concentrated. Now, therefore, Hobbes explicitly rejects the idea of the separation of powers. Now, what did modern democracy do to overturn Hobbes? Right. Modern democracy divides the power of the state into several components. For example, in India, you have the power being concentrated within the elected bodies, right? For example, the center. But there is a devolution of power into the constituent states. So the prime minister can be all powerful, but there's a check and balance, that there is parliament where he must ratify his decisions. There is the president who will ultimately sign the bill and might disagree with him. And even if the president and the prime minister are in tandem and abuse power, then there is the law, the Supreme Court, and the courts of India to strike down anything that is unconstitutional. So what is the way through which such concentration of power can be avoided? Through the framing of a constitution, through federalism and the devolution of powers, by maintaining checks and balances whereby power is distributed across various organs of the state. But Hobbes says no, that will create only division and dissension and civil war. What is the solution according to Hobbes? Give absolute power to the sovereign and the state, and within that one body will remain all power. And that is why you can see why very clearly Hobbes' idea of the state appeals to a fascist notion. But you'll have to remember one thing, that Hobbes is not writing this in void. He's writing this in the context where a civil war has ruptured society. Therefore, Hobbes' concept is aligned with the times. Actually, it is emerging from that particular situation of that particular period. Now, why therefore Leviathan? Many of you must have wondered why Hobbes calls this treatise Leviathan. Leviathan sort of represents the power of the state. The state, the sovereign, is taken from the Bible, the book of Job, and it says that Leviathan was associated with lava, to couple, connect, or join. So people are coupling, connecting, and joining. Go back to that picture once again. You see, people are joined together through their social contract. And cunning, meaning a serpent or a dragon. Remember, the biblical Leviathan is a monster, is a monstrous body. Right.
Hebrew Bible.
Right. The Hebrew Bible and the Leviathan is a monster. Why is this a monster? Because it is huge, humongous, formed by all people coming together, joined together in this humongous great body of the state. Right. Therefore, lava, and tannin, right? The interpreters believe that the creature was named using these root words because by his bigness, the state is marked, the sovereign is marked by his bigness. In him resides all the powers of the majority of the people, at least. He seems not one single creature, but a coupling of diverse together. So all creatures come together, or because his scales are closed or straightly compacted together. Look at that picture once again, and you see how compact these people are, that they have come together to form the body of the state. Right. Therefore, this is called the Leviathan. Mm-hmm. Right. Can we take the questions at the last, please? Then that will help me. Because
why? Okay.
right, I'll take the questions. I'll take them at the end of the lecture. Maybe that will help me get through. Right. Okay. Therefore, it's a giant crowned figure is seen emerging from the landscape, clutching a sword and a crozier. Beneath a quote from the book of Job, non est potestas super terram que competrio a Job. Now, there's no power on earth to be compared to him. This is from the book of Job, further linking the figure to the monster of that book. So this is the quotation that I was referring to, and this is the figure, because it brings together all the organs, as you can see in this picture of the state, into that one body of the state, and that towers over the territory. As you can see, it towers. It is all omnipotent, all powerful. Right. Now, Hobbes, this I have already referred to. Hobbes's concept is derived from the concept that human beings are summum malum, that they are naturally evil, and therefore they need this monstrous body, the state, to keep control over them. And as I had pointed out, that Hobbes is writing contrary to Aristotle, in the sense that Aristotle talked about a polis where people could come and live together peacefully. Hobbes is suggesting that it is only the power of the state that allows them to live peacefully. Now, let me come to one of the debates around Hobbes. And this, I think, was pointed out by one of my colleagues at Presidency College, Kullan, who was referring to Quentin Skinner, a critic called Quentin Skinner, who had written extensively on Hobbes and his relationship with Cromwell. Now, you see, there's a paradox. Hobbes wrote Leviathan as part of an entire process of treatises on the nature of the state. And this Hobbes wrote between 1643 to 1649. The book was published in 1651. By 1653, Cromwell had come to power. And people who agreed with the Cromwellian disposition were known as the engagers, people who engaged with the notion of the Commonwealth. Now, paradoxically, when Hobbes published his treatise, he was calling for obedience if there was protection. Right? Hobbes was calling for obedience if there was protection. Now, if Cromwell was providing this protection, then was Hobbes calling for obedience for Cromwell? This became a paradox, so that the Hobbesian text, Leviathan, was often used by the engagers to argue that if the Commonwealth, led by Cromwell, could offer protection to the people, then, as per Hobbes, they would have to provide obedience to the Commonwealth. You see, Hobbes was being turned inside out. He had written it in the earlier decade, that is 1643 to 1649, praising royalist rule, but it was being used by the parliamentarians to argue that if the parliament could provide protection, then the people would have to provide it with obedience. So under the social contract, they argued that now power lay with the Cromwellians, with the parliament, and therefore the support of the people should also be total towards this particular commonwealth. So you see how there was a debate about Hobbes. Now, what did Hobbes have to say about this? Now, Hobbes actually added a kind of an epilogue to the Leviathan, and he sort of wrote that he did not write this against the monarchy, that he was not with the engagers rather, that he was not supporting parliament, but he was supporting the cause of the royalty. But this debate lingered on, so that Hobbes lost support from the royalists, and he was also suspiciously looked on by the Cromwellians. Of course, this changed in 1660 because Hobbes had been the personal tutor to Charles II. And when Charles came back to power, he gave Hobbes a kind of a pension. But Hobbes's, and this is the question that we had discussed earlier, Hobbes's material bias, that Hobbes was talking about self-interest, that Hobbes was allowing no space for God or divinity within this entire scheme, made Hobbes a target among the royalists as a heretic, as somebody who was against the teachings of the Bible and against the teachings of the Catholic Church. And therefore, in anticipation of arrest, Hobbes had to burn all his papers. So Leviathan became a text about its reception, a text which was hugely debated. And it was used both by the royalists as well as the parliamentarians to suggest that whoever was in power and ensured peace for the subjects demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience. Therefore, this has been a critique against Leviathan, that it supports totalitarian power. And once it supports totalitarian power, it therefore allows, the breeding of a fascist state, that it provides too much power within the state. But that, my friends, is a political question. My problem is not with the politics of that. See, I'm not concerned so much about the nature of the state. What I'm concerned about is how did Hobbes's vision of this anarchic state of human nature, which is marked by self-interest, come through in the texts that you have studied, right? I am more interested in the literary representations, right? Therefore, I'm asking myself a few questions. Why is Hobbes important? Hobbes is important because not only of his political philosophy, but also because of this concept of the state of nature. What is the human nature like? And almost every philosopher, as I said yesterday, from John Locke, who said that the state of nature is a state of reason, from Rousseau, who suggests that the state of nature is a blank slate and you can condition the state of nature, and Immanuel Kant, who suggests that the state of nature can be improved and enlightened through collective rationality. Therefore, everybody talked about these moral and political questionings about the state of nature. And also the materialist bent of Hobbes's metaphysics is also in keeping with the Anglo-American metaphysics, which tends to recognize as real only those entities that physics in particular or natural science in general presupposes. Therefore, Hobbes is moving towards Western philosophy, was giving a shift to Western philosophy towards fundamentally the empirical sciences. Whatever can be verified through experience, that becomes the source of philosophy. Therefore, Hobbes initiates, if I will call it, the movement towards Enlightenment empiricism. Let me look at a few texts also to see how Hobbes is present in these texts. One of these texts you will do later on in your semesters in the fourth semester is Robinson Crusoe, right, by Daniel Defoe. And you can see how Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe becomes, on his island, a kind of absolute sovereign whose rights are absolute. And therefore, he is that Hobbesian power who holds suzerainty over Friday and the people around him. Right. Now, you can, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this primarily because I want to see how from Hobbes comes this power of the state that dominates other people. Not only does a state dominate the people within it, but if it can offer protection to another state, then it demands obedience from that state also. So is Hobbes, therefore, one of the philosophers who also led to the idea of colonialism? The Britishra jodi amader protection dite pare, tale we have to obey the British. Right? Robinson Crusoe islandটার কথা ভেবে দেখো, think of it, that Robinson Crusoe demands absolute obedience from Friday because he has protected Friday from the cannibals. Right? So how Hobbes's ideas come through within the idea of colonialism as well. Very crucial text, Gulliver's Travels, 1726, all of which you have read this. In book 4, there's a straight debate between Hobbes and Locke, right? And this is done through two kinds of people. One is the Yahoos, who are human-like, but who are anarchic, right? Singular and deformed hands and breasts were covered with thick hair. And so these are almost human-like people. Therefore, beastly in appearance, continually fighting with themselves, even if there is enough food. This is marked by sycophancy and greed and desire, appetite and filth and melancholia, right? So are these Yahoos then the representation of the Hobbesian condition of man as nasty, brutish, and short? And there's this entire concept of the contemptus mundi, that is to say that there is contempt for the human condition, right? And therefore, Swift writes that the vast numbers of our people are compelled to seek their livelihood by begging, robbing, stealing, etc. It's almost a Hobbesian vision of the universe, isn't it? Novels, Tom Jones, 1749. Now, once again, here you see various people in Tom's world marked by total greed. And there is almost an anarchy within society, which the squire Allworthy of that particular county must maintain discipline in through prudence. So the people that you see in Tom's world, be it Square, who preaches the eternal fitness of things, but he himself is corrupted, Thwackum, who is the Calvinist, but who is himself corrupted again, Blifil, Northerton, all of these characters, they represent the Hobbesian vision of man as essentially marked by self-interest, anarchy, and greed. Of course, this reaches the climax in another 1726 text by John Gay called The Beggars Opera, where you have in society outlaws and criminals who follow the Hobbesian doctrine of self-interest, the magistrate who is also guided by self-interest, the prison keeper who is also guided by self-interest. Therefore, almost every single organ of the state is corrupted and marked by self-interest, which is a feature of the Hobbesian universe. Right. Now, therefore, there's a pervasive satire on money and London body politic. Now, you will not read Gay this year, but what you will read is a text which is almost similar, but which is prior to Hobbes, and that is Johnson's Volcanic, where once again you will see a Hobbesian vision, where in front of greed and money and self-interest, all the institutions of state, profession, fatherhood, husband will all collapse. Therefore, what Hobbes is suggesting is a state of nature which is marked by war of every man against every man, of relentless self-interest, and therefore a state where there is continuous civil conflict within individuals. Now, this vision of the state of nature as marked by self-interest is therefore a state of nature which is offered by Hobbes. It is countered, of course, by a lot of people, as I said, Locke, most importantly, who says that in the state of nature, we are rational, we will want peace and the greatest good of the greatest number. Secondly, once again, as I mentioned, Rousseau, there is no state of nature, and that state of nature is a blank slate. Whatever you write on it, however you condition it, is the state of nature. So your upbringing is your state of nature. And thirdly, by Hume, who suggests that the state of nature is social, that we are naturally social and we therefore will bond together, and therefore the state of nature is in socialization, right? But what I want you to learn, I want you to concentrate on is that why did Hobbes write what he did write? And the context of the Civil War, as Quentin Skinner repeatedly points out, is a most important aspect of Hobbes's treatise. He wrote this, when he wrote this, at that point in history, when a civil war was completely sort of tearing England apart. And therefore, his plea was for a powerful, omnipotent sovereign and state power which could bring peace and order into the society. Ironically, he was writing for a royalist cause, but it was often used by the parliamentarians to justify their hold on power. Ultimately, what Hobbes is suggesting is a very powerful, centrist, almost fascist state, which has the power to censor, which has the power to punish, and which has the power to override minority opinion, and through a transfer of rights, establish the power of the sovereign. How is it different from the divine right of kingship? That this power is not sanctioned by God. This power is sanctioned by the people, by the social contract, transferring their rights into the body of the sovereign. The body of the sovereign, remember, is an artificial body, that it is created by the people by transferring their rights. Once those rights are transferred, it is absolute. Finally, Hobbes has been a much maligned political philosopher, but he remains one of the pioneers of the Enlightenment because he is divorcing political science, the science of power, from religion altogether. He's suggesting that it is the material state of nature that leads to the material nature of the state. Right. It is with that that I bring this discussion to a, my presentation to a close. And I will be glad to now take your questions. I'm sorry I interrupted somebody while she was asking a question. Please don't mind. You can of course fire away now. বলো কি জিজ্ঞাসা করছি? বলো কে জিজ্ঞাসা করছিলে? এবার আনমিউট করে